the rhythmic chugging of a steam engine, the gentle rocking of a passenger car, the vast American landscape unfolding outside the window. These images conjure a sense of unity, of connection, of a nation bound together by iron rails. But imagine a journey interrupted, passengers disembarking, luggage transferred, all because the tracks ahead were just slightly too narrow, or perhaps a little too wide. This was the reality for much of the 19th century in the United States, a time when the dream of a transcontinental railroad collided with the stubborn realities of varying gauges. To truly understand how this came to be, we must first examine its origins and the early days of railroading in both Great Britain and the United States. The story of railroad gauge standardization, or rather the lack thereof, in the United States is a complex and fascinating one, stretching across decades and intertwined with regional rivalries, economic considerations, and even the looming shadow of civil war. The very first railways, of course, were not American at all, but rather British. In the early 19th century, engineers in Great Britain were experimenting with various forms of locomotion, seeking more efficient ways to transport coal and other goods. These early lines often utilized horses to pull wagons along wooden or iron rails, but the advent of the steam engine revolutionized the industry. One of the pioneers of steam locomotion was George Stephenson, a British engineer who is often credited as the father of railways. Stephenson's early locomotives, such as the Blucher and the Locomotion, proved the viability of steam-powered rail transport. He also played a crucial role in the construction of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, which opened in 1825, and is widely considered to be the first public railway in the world to use steam locomotives. Now, the key to our story lies in the distance between the rails, what we call the gauge. Stephenson, for the Stockton and Darlington, chose a gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches, or 1435 millimeters. This seemingly arbitrary measurement is in fact steeped in historical anecdote, though its exact origins are debated. One common explanation is that Stephenson used the same gauge as earlier horse-drawn wagonways, which in turn may have been based on the width of Roman chariot wheels. The idea is that ruts had already been worn into roadways at this spacing, and so it made sense to use the same gauge for the new railways. Another, perhaps more plausible, theory is that the gauge was simply a practical one for the size of the horses and wagons used at the time. Whatever the precise reason, Stephenson's choice of 4 feet 8.5 inches had a profound impact on the future of railways, as Stephenson's locomotives and engineering expertise became increasingly sought after. The 4 feet 8.5 inch gauge became the standard for many British railways. He even designed and built locomotives for some of the very first American railroads, and so this gauge began to appear across the Atlantic as well. However, not everyone in Great Britain agreed with Stephenson's gauge. One prominent engineer, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, believed that a wider gauge would offer greater stability and allow for larger, more powerful locomotives. Brunel, a brilliant and somewhat eccentric figure, was the chief engineer of the Great Western Railway, one of the most ambitious railway projects of the era. For the Great Western, which began construction in the 1830s, Brunel adopted a gauge of 7 feet and a quarter inch, often referred to as the broad gauge. Brunel argued that the broad gauge provided a smoother, faster ride, and allowed for the use of larger wheels and axles, which could, in theory, handle greater loads and higher speeds. He envisioned a railway system that was not just functional, but also elegant and comfortable. The Great Western Railway was known for its luxurious carriages and its smooth, almost silent ride, thanks in part to the wider gauge. The adoption of two different gauges in Great Britain, Stephenson's standard gauge and Brunel's broad gauge, inevitably led to problems. Passengers and goods travelling between railways using different gauges had to be transferred at break-of-gauge points, adding time and expense to journeys. This inconvenience led to what became known as the Gauge Wars, a period of intense competition between the proponents of the different gauges. In 1845, the British government established a gauge commission to investigate the issue and recommend a standard gauge for the country. After careful deliberation, the commission concluded that the 4 feet 8.5 inch gauge was preferable, primarily because it was already the most widely used gauge in the country. The Commission's report led to the Gauge Act of 1846, which officially adopted 4 feet 8.5 inches as the standard gauge for Great Britain, though the Great Western Railway was allowed to continue operating its broad gauge lines. The gauge wars in Britain offer a crucial precedent for understanding what would later occur in the United States. The clash between different engineering philosophies, the economic interests at stake, and the eventual decision in favor of a single standard gauge all foreshadowed the American experience. Across the Atlantic, the United States was eagerly embracing the railway revolution. The first American railroads were built in the late 1820s and early 1830s, initially focused on connecting canals and rivers to facilitate the movement of goods. Like their British counterparts, these early American railways experimented with various gauges. There was no national standard, and individual railway companies were free to choose whatever gauge they thought best suited their needs. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, one of the oldest and most important railroads in the United States, initially used a gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches. Influenced by the British model, other early railroads, however, adopted different gauges. The Pennsylvania Railroad, for example, initially used a gauge of 4 feet 10 inches. In the South, a gauge of 5 feet became common, particularly among railroads in the states of Georgia and South Carolina. The reasons for the proliferation of different gauges in the United States were varied. Some engineers, like Brunel in Britain, believed that wider gauges offered advantages in terms of stability and power. Others chose gauges based on local conditions, such as the availability of materials or the topography of the land. Still others simply adopted the gauge used by a neighboring railroad or by a supplier of locomotives and rolling stock. Regional rivalries and economic self-interest also played a significant role. Railroads were seen as vital to economic development, and each city and state wanted to ensure that it had the best possible connections to other markets. Choosing a different gauge than a rival city or region could give a railroad a competitive advantage, as it would force passengers and goods to transfer to its lines. In the South, the 5-foot gauge became particularly entrenched. Some historians argue that this was a deliberate attempt to isolate the Southern rail network from the North, hindering potential military incursions in the event of war. While this theory is debated, it is clear that the 5-foot gauge served to create a distinct regional rail system in the South. The lack of standardization in gauge quickly became a problem in the United States, just as it had in Britain. As the rail network expanded, passengers and goods often had to be transferred between trains at break of gauge points. This was inconvenient, time-consuming, and expensive. It also hindered the development of a truly national rail system, one that could seamlessly connect different regions of the country. Imagine, if you will, traveling by train from New York to Chicago in the 1850s. You might have to change trains several times along the way, simply because the tracks used different gauges. Each change would involve disembarking from one train, waiting for your luggage to be transferred, and boarding another train, all of which could add hours to your journey. For freight shipments, the process was even more cumbersome, as goods had to be unloaded from one train and reloaded onto another, increasing the risk of damage and delays. Despite the growing problems caused by varying gauges, there was little momentum for standardization in the early years of American railroading. Individual railroad companies were reluctant to invest in converting their lines to a different gauge, as this would be a costly and disruptive undertaking. There was also no central authority with the power to impose a standard gauge on the entire country. The federal government, in the 19th century, generally took a laissez-faire approach to economic matters, preferring to leave decisions about infrastructure and development to the states and private companies. While the government did provide land grants and other subsidies to railroads, it did not attempt to regulate their gauge. The situation remained largely unchanged through the 1850s, as the American rail network continued to expand and the number of different gauges in use continued to grow. By the start of the Civil War, there were at least 6 different gauges in use across the United States, ranging from 4 feet 8.5 inches to 6 feet. This patchwork of gauges severely hampered the efficiency of the rail system and created significant obstacles to both passenger and freight traffic. The Civil War, which began in 1861, brought the issue of gauge incompatibility into sharp focus. The war effort required the rapid and efficient movement of troops and supplies, and the lack of a standard gauge made this much more difficult. The Union Army, for example, often struggled to transport troops and equipment across the country due to the need to transfer between different rail lines. The Confederacy, with its predominantly 5-foot gauge rail network, faced even greater challenges. The Southern rail system was less extensive than the North's, and the break of gauge points made it difficult to move troops and supplies quickly and efficiently. The Union blockade of southern ports also made it difficult to import new locomotives and rolling stock, further straining the Confederate rail system. While the Civil War highlighted the problems caused by varying gauges, it did not immediately lead to standardization. The war disrupted the rail network, but it did not fundamentally alter the existing gauge infrastructure. After the war, the focus was on rebuilding and expanding the rail system, and the issue of gauge standardization was largely put on the back burner. In the years following the Civil War, the United States experienced a period of rapid economic growth and industrialization. The railroad played a crucial role in this expansion, connecting distant markets and facilitating the movement of goods and people across the country. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, symbolized this new era of connectivity and progress. However, the lack of gauge standardization continued to be a significant obstacle to the efficient operation of the rail system. The problem was particularly acute in the South, where the 5-foot gauge remained dominant. Passengers and goods traveling between the North and the South still had to be transferred at break of gauge points, adding time and expense to journeys. Despite the ongoing problems, there was still resistance to standardization. Some railroad companies were reluctant to invest in converting their lines to the standard gauge, fearing the financial burden and the disruption to their operations. Others argued that their existing gauge was superior and that standardization would sacrifice efficiency and performance. The economic interests of different regions and industries also played a role. Companies that manufactured locomotives and rolling stock for a particular gauge had a vested interest in maintaining that gauge. Similarly, cities and regions that had invested in infrastructure based on a particular gauge were hesitant to change. The issue of gauge standardization became increasingly intertwined with the politics of Reconstruction in the South. Some Northerners saw gauge standardization as a way to further integrate the South into the national economy and political system. They argued that a standard gauge would facilitate trade and travel between the North and the South and would help to break down regional barriers. However, many Southerners resisted these efforts, viewing them as an attempt to impose Northern values and control on the South. They argued that the 5-foot gauge was well suited to the South's needs, and that standardization would be costly and unnecessary. The debate over gauge standardization became another battleground in the larger struggle over Reconstruction and the future of the South. As the 1870s progressed, however, the pressure for gauge standardization began to mount. The economic advantages of a uniform gauge became increasingly apparent as the volume of freight and passenger traffic grew. The break of gauge points were a major bottleneck in the rail system, and they added significantly to the cost of transportation. The growing power of the railroad industry also played a role. As railroads consolidated and became larger and more powerful, they began to exert greater influence over government policy. Railroad executives increasingly recognized that gauge standardization would benefit the industry as a whole by reducing costs and improving efficiency. The arguments in favor of standardization were compelling. A standard gauge would allow for the seamless movement of trains across the country without the need for transfers at break of gauge points. This would save time and money for both passengers and freight shippers. It would also make the rail system more efficient and reliable, and would facilitate trade and commerce. Standardization would also simplify the manufacturing and maintenance of locomotives and rolling stock. With a single gauge, manufacturers could produce standardized equipment which would reduce costs and improve quality. Railroads would also be able to share equipment more easily and would have access to a larger pool of spare parts. Despite the clear advantages of standardization, the process of converting the rail network to a uniform gauge was a complex and challenging undertaking. It would require significant investment, careful planning, and close cooperation between different railroad companies and regions. There were also technical challenges to overcome, such as the need to adapt existing locomotives and rolling stock to the standard gauge. The first major step towards gauge standardization in the United States came in 1886. A coalition of southern railroads, recognizing the economic benefits of a standard gauge, agreed to convert their lines to the 4 feet 8.5-inch gauge. This was a bold and ambitious undertaking, involving thousands of miles of track and a massive logistical effort. The conversion was scheduled to take place over 2 days, May 31st and June 1st, 1886. During this period, thousands of workers toiled to move one rail on each track closer to its partner by 3 inches. This seemingly small adjustment would allow standard gauge trains to run on the formerly 5-foot gauge lines. The logistical challenges were immense. Railroad companies had to coordinate the movement of trains, the delivery of materials, and the deployment of work crews. They also had to communicate effectively with passengers and shippers to minimize disruption to traffic. The conversion was a remarkable feat of engineering and organization. In just 36 hours, thousands of miles of track were converted to the standard gauge. The South's rail network was effectively integrated into the national system, and the era of break-of-gauge points was largely brought to an end. The event became known as the Great Gauge Change, and it marked a turning point in the history of American railroads. The conversion was not without its challenges. Some railroads experienced delays and disruptions, and there were a few accidents. However, the overall success of the project demonstrated the feasibility of gauge standardization on a large scale. The Great Gauge Change in the South paved the way for nationwide gauge standardization. In the years following 1886, most of the remaining railroads in the United States converted to the 4 feet 8.5-inch gauge. By the end of the 19th century, the standard gauge was virtually universal across the country. The adoption of a standard gauge had a profound impact on the American economy and society. It facilitated the efficient movement of goods and people, reduced transportation costs, and stimulated trade and commerce. It also helped to unify the country by making it easier for people to travel and interact with one another. The story of gauge standardization in the United States is a reminder of the importance of infrastructure in economic development. A well-designed and efficient infrastructure system can be a powerful engine of growth, while a poorly designed system can hinder progress. The struggle to standardize railroad gauge highlights the complexities of infrastructure development and the challenges of balancing competing interests and priorities. The legacy of the gauge wars can still be seen today in the physical remnants of old rail lines and in the historical records of railway companies. The story of gauge standardization is also a reminder of the human ingenuity and perseverance that went into building the American rail system. The engineers, workers, and entrepreneurs who built the railroads faced immense challenges, but they ultimately succeeded in creating a transportation network that transformed the country. The 4 feet 8.5-inch gauge, once just one of many gauges in use, has become the global standard for railways. It is a testament to the vision of George Stephenson and the engineers who adopted his gauge in the early days of railroading. It is also a testament to the power of standardization and the benefits that can be achieved by adopting common standards and practices. The rhythmic rumble of a train on a standardized gauge, stretching across vast distances, is a subtle but powerful symbol of connection and progress. It is a reminder of the long and sometimes arduous journey that has led to the modern rail system and a testament to the enduring importance of infrastructure in shaping our world. The story of the failed attempts and eventual success in standardizing gauge across the United States is a fascinating chapter in the history of transportation, a chapter filled with engineering challenges, economic considerations, and the human drive to connect and move forward. And now, as the rhythmic sounds of the rails fade into the background, perhaps a peaceful sleep will soon follow.